on YouTube. Again, hey there, students. Tom Richey here, and we are live for some APUSH review. We are going to be live every time that we're going to be here at 6:30 p.m. All right, 6:30 p.m. Eastern, Monday through Thursday. Okay, so this is going to be a Monday through Thursday thing, and there's going to be live review that's going to be free and public and everything like that. Now, I do want to tell y'all about something that I've got going on tomorrow night, Tuesday night at 9:30 p.m. Eastern. We will have a multiple choice strategy session. Okay, so that's a premium review. That's going to be on Tuesday at 9:30 p.m. Eastern. Okay, so 9:30 p.m. Eastern, and I'm going to go ahead and share that in the YouTube chat. It's also in the YouTube description. Okay, so it's in the YouTube description. It's in the YouTube chat, and that's going to be available if you are in the Crowdcast. I'm sharing the link there. You can go to crowdcast.io/Tom Richey. Now, also remember, this broadcast is brought to you by Romulus APUSH Review. It's a little app I've got on the App Store, little trivia app. I mean, it's a small thing, but I think it does big things. Okay, because Teddy Roosevelt said, speak softly and carry a big stick. I say speak softly and carry a big app. Okay, so with that, it's not that big of an app, but it's basically a trivia app that basically we've got these things here that you can go into any topic that you go into. It's on the App Store. It's also on Google Play. It's called Romulus APUSH Review, and you can go into any of these topics and it'll give you questions. And this is just a handy way to review. A lot of times students just, they forget, like, what was this? What year was this? Or when did this happen? Those were the coercive acts. Okay, intolerable acts. And this is something, if you go through this and you spend some time actually going through this brain development, if you are playing games like this, this is something that's very helpful. So Romulus APUSH Review is just a little $2.99 purchase at the App Store. And remember, Tuesday at 9:30 p.m. Eastern, that is tomorrow evening, we're going to have the multiple choice strategy session. So with that, let's go ahead and get into your questions. The focus of tonight is going to be 1754 to 1800, that so-called Unit 3 in the APUSH curriculum. So that's coming from the French and Indian War to the election of Jefferson. Now, nobody is, as far as that goes, I don't see anything, anything here as far as questions so far. So let's see what we've got coming as far as that. But let's see what we've got here. So I'll go ahead and just start talking about some things if we don't have any questions yet. So let me go ahead. Now, another thing is, let me say, APUSH period 3 cheat sheet. This is something I made a couple of years ago for the 2020 exam. Now, I'm not telling you to cheat on the exam. Tom Richey does not condone cheating on the exam, but let's go ahead. Yeah, I know that chat is lit, is it not? Those of you on the Crowdcast here. And so let me go ahead and put that Unit 3 cheat sheet out there. Now, that was a couple years ago. They allowed people to have like an open notes test. And so I created something here that basically just kind of goes into the main things here that are going on. All right. So, I bring in some vocabulary, some things about the American Revolution, the Articles of Confederation. So that's a little 3-pager there. Could be a helpful little review thing. But let's go ahead and start with the French and Indian War. Okay. So since I don't see any questions yet, I'm going to start with the French and Indian War. And I've actually got a longer version of this on YouTube. But the French and Indian War as a turning point. Okay. So when we think about the French and Indian War, what we want to note more than anything is, how did the French and Indian War change the relationship between Britain and its North American colonies? And so remember, the purpose of a colony is to make a profit for the mother country. Okay. And the Navigation Acts were designed to make sure that Britain, the British colonies, did turn a profit. And so the Navigation Acts were passed in the 1600s. They governed overseas trade in Britain in the 17th and 18th centuries. And what we want to understand is the Navigation Acts are a specific example of mercantilism. And mercantilism is basically a policy where the government is controlling trade in order to preserve gold and silver. So when you import things, you pay out with gold and silver. And at the time, the nations thought, you know, the wealthiest nation is the one that has the most gold and silver. Of course, Adam Smith, you know, he questioned this, he disputed this in his book, Wealth of Nations. But at the time, this was the conventional wisdom. So the Navigation Acts were passed, and on the books, you know, Britain and the British colonies, they had a mercantilistic system, but this was not enforced. Okay, so the thing is, before the French and Indian War, this was not enforced, and you had a system of what's called salutary neglect. Now, salutary, usually neglect is a bad thing, okay? Usually neglect is a bad thing, but salutary, I'm saluting. You see, it's like salute neglect here. And so with that, it's a good neglect. And basically they were letting, you know, they wanted to promote trade, and that's the top priority there. And there was also a very limited troop presence, okay? And so with this, before the French and Indian War, the Navigation Acts were not enforced. There was salutary neglect, and there aren't very many British troops. Okay, so as far as that, you know, so as far as that goes, that we see this now. As far as that goes, I'm going to let y'all know I will be doing some Instagram shout outs here and there. So at Tom Richey on Instagram, you know, would be you know, if you want to get a shout out, that's a great you know, great thing to do there. And so as far as that goes, that the French and Indian War resulted in a high national debt for Britain. And so the British come to a few conclusions. Basically, now, first of all, the colonies were not very effective in responding to the French threat on their own. Benjamin Franklin, you know, so he made this join or die cartoon. Okay, so basically, this was during the French and Indian War. Some people mistakenly place this as being during the American Revolution, but this join or die cartoon, Benjamin Franklin's like, look, here is what he called the current disunited state of the colonies, okay? That the colonies are disunited, and that is a problem because they can't come together. And so with that, you know, the colonies didn't respond to the French threat. And so the British had to resort to a direct military intervention in North America. And this was expensive. The British came under massive debt. So the British were like, look, we're going to place taxes on these colonies. We're going to make them help pay for the war. And the colonists need to pay for British troops to be permanently stationed in North America. So no more salutary neglect. Strict enforcement of the Navigation Acts, where revenue becomes the government's top priority. And then remember, here are these British troops. Okay, so that's what we're looking at after the French and Indian War, that the goal becomes revenue. The Navigation Acts are enforced, no more salutary neglect, the presence of British troops. Also remember that the French and Indian War is the end of, you know, French Louisiana, French Canada, basically any kind of French control in North America, that the French lose their colonies. Now, of course, the French are going to come back and they're going to get their revenge on Britain, right? They're going to help us win the American Revolution. Now, the immediate or direct effect, that's something to kind of note here. One of the words that you'll see on the APUSH exam very often is directly or most directly. So when we talk about directly or most directly, we're talking about this was something that immediately led to this, okay? Whereas a long-term effect is something that, okay, we can say that there's a causal relationship, but it's not necessarily immediate. And so as far as that goes, the long-term effect of the, you know, the French and Indian War is the American Revolution. I mean, you note here that the colonies, they declare their independence only 13 years after the French and Indian War concludes. And so again, the immediate effect is that there's tension between colonists and the British government. And I like to alliterate, okay? So over taxation, troops, and trade restrictions. Okay, so that's something we see there. So that's the French and Indian War. Let's see if we've got any, you know, any questions coming here, and let's see also if I've got some shout outs to give there. Actually, yeah. So we've got Russell Putnam, Rebecca. We've got Arts of Cam, Susie Cusey. 95 there. How about that? Or actually, high school teacher. Okay. So, and a Texan. How about that? Remember the Alamo. Okay. So we've got, Miss Lewis. Shout out to Miss Lewis and her students there. Cheap Bass and Constantine 77. SSSYNB 56. Eric ZH 4NG. Thank y'all for the follows here. Okay. So, for the support on Instagram and all of that kind of stuff. So with that, let's go ahead and see what we've got as far as questions. Yeah, these review sessions are going to be about an hour each. And there is the queen of questions herself, Miss Landers. Okay, shout out to Miss Landers and her students. So, need to know for the Constitutional Convention. Now, one of the most important things is, now, George, you're asking me to drop the slideshow as far as you want to get a copy of that. This is going to be like on my YouTube channel and on Crowdcast. You will be able to see the archive of this session. So it's like you'll be able to rewind. Also, George, if you just search on YouTube, the French and Indian War as a turning point, you'll be able to see those slides there. So the need to know for the Constitutional Convention. So Miss Landers, thank you so much for being here. And basically, the big understanding is that the Constitution was the product of a number of compromises. Okay, so we start off with an argument like this, and then we've got things that we can use in order to justify this argument, basically to give supporting evidence. So when we think about the Constitutional Convention, you want to think about, first of all, of course, the Constitutional Convention was called in order to amend the Articles, right? So basically, another thing here is we want to think in terms of Shay's rebellion is something that was when we think about cause and effect. So if we were thinking something about the Constitution, we might go into Shay's rebellion. That could be part of our contextualization. So Shay's rebellion in Massachusetts went on for some months, and this exposed in a lot of ways the weakness of the Articles of Confederation and showed that the Articles were not going to be adequate to govern the United States. And so as far as that goes, the Articles, remember, did not give the federal government the ability to collect taxes. Now, one thing I want to clear up about the Articles is some people, when they're looking at the article or thinking about the Articles, that they'll say that it didn't allow Congress to raise an army. That was not the case. Okay, what we want to think about here is federalism. Now, what the Constitution and the Articles have in common is this idea of federalism. Now, APUSH students, remember, there's the idea of federalism, 2 levels of government with sovereignty in each of them. Then there are federalists who wanted to ratify the Constitution, and then there is Alexander Hamilton's Federalist Party. Okay, so note here, there's the idea of federalism. There are the people who wanted to ratify the Constitution, and then there was the Federalist Party. So you need to be able to distinguish between all those things there. And so as far as that goes, the Articles of Confederation, I tell people, think of it as a glorified military alliance. Okay, so when we think about this, sometimes we think about the differences between the Constitution and the Articles. But what we want to think about in terms of, first of all, they both have a federal system of government where the states and the central government share power. Also, in both of them, the central government handles foreign relations. Okay, so the Articles of Confederation, when it came to an army and navy, war and peace, sending and receiving ambassadors, that is completely the same as the Constitution and the Articles. Okay, so we've got both of those there. And so with that, we also would note here that the Articles of Confederation didn't have an independent executive branch, didn't have a president, and didn't have the Supreme Court. Now, also the Constitution, it called for, it provided for the calling forth of the militia to execute the laws of the Union and suppress insurrections. All right. So Shay's rebellion, we want to know that that is a causal relationship there. Also, we want to know the Commerce Clause. And this is also going to be important for you for AP government, that under the Articles of Confederation, the federal government had no means by which to control trade or interstate commerce. There was nothing to stop North Carolina from putting a trade embargo on South Carolina, because remember, contextually, the states were very, very hesitant to give up any kind of power, any kind of economic powers to an outside government because of what they just experienced in the American Revolution. Remember, the American Revolution will nearly always provide good contextualization if we're looking at a topic like the Articles or the Constitution or something like that. What I always think of for contextualization, I think of what I call the proximity relevance axis. Okay, and so the best, the best contextualization is going to be, close. It's typically going to be close. It's typically going to be relevant. So think of an axis there, a dual axis. And so when we think about this, that it should typically be close to the topic chronologically, and then also relevant, that it's no use having good proximity if it's irrelevant. So you want to think about something that is on the proximity relevance axis. Now, the reason I call it an axis, if it's highly relevant, then it doesn't have to be so close. So when you think about foreign policy in the early 20th century, you could use Washington's neutrality proclamation as farewell address if you're talking about foreign policy in the late 1930s, the United States hesitating to get involved in World War II. So again, if it is super relevant, it doesn't have to be quite so close. And so with that, oh my goodness, that is so funny there, Kaylee, with the federalism. Okay, so with that, you know what? I will do an Among Us game sometime this week. Okay, sometime this week, I will adjourn this session into a game of Among Us. I feel like that would be kind of fun. So with that, I had to update it on my phone, but I'll look into it. So note here that when we look at the Constitutional Convention, the stated purpose was to amend the Articles of Confederation. Now, that's not what they're going to do. They're going to have like a pretty new thing. They're going to write a plan of government from scratch. Now, in my APUSH class, what I like to do when we're talking about the Constitutional Convention, I like to read One Fish, Two Fish, Red Fish, Blue Fish. And I like to read it so much that I don't even have it here at home. I've got it at my school because I read it to my students this year. And so what I think of is large state, small state, slave state, free state. And when we're putting the groundwork for all of these compromises, we have to think in terms of the large states have their interests, the small states have their interests, the slave states have their interest, and the free states have their interest. And so there's got to be some kind of compromise, or else they're not going to be able to agree on a plan of government. And thank you. Vote for Brianna Dubon. All right, so y'all make sure to vote for her. It looks like. And so then we've got Izzy and Ashley. Thank y'all so much for your support. All right. So with that, when we go into the Constitutional Convention, now one thing we'll note is that Virginia, now you'd have to include the slave population to get this number, which is going to be significant to the Constitutional Convention. But Virginia has 20% of the inhabitants of these states. So by far the largest state at the time. Now, Pennsylvania is a distant second, okay? So when you think about the Virginia plan, this is the largest state in the Union that is basically saying, look, here's the Virginia plan, and they want a bicameral legislature based on population. Now, the New Jersey plan, you don't have to know Patterson's name necessarily. James Madison, it would be very helpful because he's a recurring figure here in the so-called father of the Constitution, like James Madison, just look at your little baby Constitution, And so with that, the New Jersey plan, unicameral legislature, one vote per state. Now, this is kind of a troll job because he's like, hey, this sounds familiar, doesn't it? Sounds like the Articles. I thought we were here to amend the Articles. Now, as far as that goes, the Great Compromise. So when we think about the Great Compromise, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, says, let's have a bicameral legislature. And again, not so much, whether you know his name or not, but the House of Representatives and the Senate, the upper house having equal representation, 2 votes per state. whereas the lower house is based on population. Now, those of you who are familiar with the progressive era, at first, the House of Representatives was directly elected by voters, giving the government a tinge of democracy, whereas the Senate would be appointed by the state legislature. So that's the great compromise between the large states and the small states. And then you've got the 3/5 compromise, where basically slaves will be counted as 3/5 of a person. Now, in order to compromise on that, the North, in order to agree to the 3/5, is that after 20 years, Congress will have the power to regulate, and that can be read outlaw. Congress can outlaw the international slave trade, which at the time it was believed, okay, they thought that they were making a fair trade here because on one hand, 3/5 of the slaves will be counted as 3/5 of a person. The South gets that rather than counted as nothing. But on the other side, they believed at the time that discontinuing the international slave trade was going to be a mortal blow to slavery. Now, that did not end up happening. Now, Congress did outlaw the international slave trade in 1808. January 1st, 1808, Congress had already passed the law. And it was passed really without any kind of like sectional disputes. Like Thomas Jefferson, a slaveholder himself, actually asked for that legislation. He asked for it from Congress in his annual message in 1806. And so that's the 3/5 compromise. Now, know that they create, the presidency and that sort of thing there. And the president is elected through the Electoral College, which basically the large states get more electoral votes, but the small states get a head start. So, this happens to where, California today gets the largest amount of votes, but then states like Wyoming and North Dakota and South Dakota, these are states that are, they're getting for their population, they're getting a lot of bang for their buck. These smaller states get more electoral votes by proportion. And so as far as that, now the Commerce Clause is something both for this class and for AP government to make sure that you know, because this says that the federal government controls interstate commerce. And this is something that's important, like when you think about labor strikes in the late 19th century. So when there's the Great Railroad Strike and the Pullman Strike, the federal government says, well, the federal government controls interstate commerce, and this strike is getting in the way of interstate commerce. And so they shut down, they go and they use military force, they use the judicial power and all of that, arrest Eugene Debs, so that's based on the Commerce Clause. And the Commerce Clause says that Congress will control interstate commerce, and the states will continue to control commerce within their states. And that's something, if you look to the New Deal and Schechter versus the United States, Schechter Poultry Corporation versus the United States, that is something where the Supreme Court, they declare the National Industrial Recovery Act, part of FDR's New Deal, they declare it unconstitutional. And they declare it that because they say, look, the Schechter brothers they're operating a local business. And so as far as that goes, I think those are going to be the main things from the Constitutional Convention. But remember, the big thing, it's a product of compromise. And the other part of that is we want to remember that even the ratification of the Constitution between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, this is something that ended up being a compromise, because what happened is that the Federalists, they wanted the Constitution to be ratified as is, as it came out of Philadelphia. Whereas the Anti-Federalists, they didn't want to ratify it. But what happened is Madison realizes, look, there are some of these Anti-Federalists that if we add a Bill of Rights, all of a sudden they're fine with it. Okay, so there were some Anti-Federalists that said, if this thing had a Bill of Rights, then I would be fine with this. And so what Madison does is Madison engineers a compromise. Now, Hamilton wrote in Federalist 84, this thing doesn't need a Bill of Rights. You know, and I mean, of course, we know why Hamilton said that, because the Bill of Rights limits the power of the federal government. And so that's something that the ratification of the Constitution, it's not that the Federalists won, so to speak, because the Federalists wanted the Constitution ratified without a Bill of Rights. It was ratified with a Bill of Rights. Okay, so as far as that goes, oh my goodness, Titus, my anaconda don't. My anaconda don't. Okay, so as far as that goes, ladies and gentlemen, yeah, he brought in the Anaconda Plan. Now, join or die, that is the American Revolution. Let's talk about snakes in U.S. history, actually, now that Titus has brought that up. That when we think about like join or die, that is the French and Indian War. And of course, during the American Revolution, you've got that Gadsden "Don't Tread on Me" flag, which symbolizes the unity of the colonies against British tyranny and oppression. Now, when we get to the Civil War, the Anaconda Plan, what we want to note about an anaconda, it wraps around you, right? You know, that anaconda wraps around you and it slowly strangles you. And this is something like when you think about when you think about the Civil War, the South, which this is something here that, when we, yeah, like that, huh? Got some Nicki Minaj going in here. And so when you think about the South is really in the same kind of boat as the Japanese in World War II. The Japanese, they were counting on a quick victory, okay? So the Japanese, if they had any hope of getting any kind of like armistice from the United States, they were going to have to get a series of quick victories, all right? Now, that didn't happen, or at least they didn't get as many as they thought they got. But in the Pacific War, the Japanese were actually doing quite well for a while, but not for long enough, okay? So the South in the Civil War had to have a quick victory because the North had twice the population. They had almost 3 times the banking capital, and they had about 6 times the number of manufacturing workers. And so with that, the Anaconda Plan, this is something that was devised by Winfield Scott that was kind of, it wasn't thought of well in the North, where Abraham Lincoln thought that, oh, this is going to be over in 90 days. I need 75,000 troops for 90 days. And then Winfield Scott's like, look, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to kind of strangle the South. Like, this isn't going to happen overnight, that you're going to have to use a naval blockade. You're going to have to take the Mississippi River, and you're going to have to capture the Confederate capital at Richmond. Now, of course, capturing Richmond on the map, it should have been the easiest thing, ends up being something that it takes the Union 4 years to do. So with that, that is the Anaconda Plan, which that has to do with the Civil War. Now, while we're on the Civil War and while we're on snakes, remember Copperheads, this was the term that Northern Republicans gave to Northern Democrats who were against the war. So there was an anti-war movement in the North, largely, championed by the Democratic Party, because without the South, the Democratic Party was a minority party in the North. And so that's something, yeah, when we look at those snakes, but the simple answer to your question is no, but I always enjoyed that. I tell you, anaconda don't. All right. So how much do we need to know about various conflicts between colonists and natives? Okay, Ruby, on the last thing that we were doing here, I mentioned, and I'll just put it up on the screen real quick, and feel free to take a screen grab or something like that, is that they're actually, two things are brought up in the course and exam description. I'm going to go ahead and put those on the screen. We talked about them a bit last time, so I'm not going to dwell on it. But the Pueblo Revolt and King Philip's War, these are 2 things that actually show up in the course and exam description in the blue boxes. So make sure that you take a look at the Pueblo Revolt and at King Philip's War. Those are going to be important. Okay, so keep that in mind, and we'll keep going from there. So going from that, let's go on to the next question. Let me check the YouTube chat. All right, look at that. We've got Marco Learning showed up there. Now, while y'all are, while y'all are following on Instagram and that sort of thing, make sure y'all remember to follow Marco Learning as well. They are, they're, providing support in so many subjects. All right. So as far as that goes, Miss Coacher APUSH students, little shout out here. Brianna, I've already gone over earlier in the broadcast. We mentioned salutary neglect. So going on from there, let's see here. Did I? Let's see. So going about. Wait. I don't know. Something's happening here. All right. So let's see. Copperheads. Yeah. So the Copperheads, they opposed the Civil War, and they didn't call themselves Copperheads, but they didn't call themselves Copperheads, but Northern Republicans called them Copperheads. Okay. So as far as that goes, let's see here that, over the presidents, yada, yada. Let's see. How much should students focus on the Quasi-War? I don't think the Quasi-War is, is necessarily a huge topic here. I think a student could really know very little about it, but here's something. I did see, there is a 2018 exam that has been released to teachers, where there was a question about foreign policy. Like there was a DBQ. The DBQ actually addresses foreign policy. So the thing is that I wouldn't know like the ins and outs of the Quasi-War, but it is good to know that, okay, the Alien and Sedition Acts. So when we think about the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were passed by Congress, a Federalist Congress during the Adams administration, that the Alien and Sedition Acts, this is something that basically, why is it that Congress felt that they had the right, like Michael Scott would say, who do you think you are? What gives you the right? That this is something that, what gives Congress the right to, what gives Congress the right to ban the freedom of the press and freedom of speech? Well, Congress would say we're at war. That's what gives us the right. That's who we think we are. And so, basically, if you want to know the Quasi-War, I think the biggest thing here is to understand two things. Like the greater part that, the Jeffersonian Republicans, they accused the Federalists of being pro-British. And this was a time when most of the American public, they supported the French Revolution. I mean, the French Revolution, there are a lot of heads getting cut off, but France is trying to start a republic here. The United States had just been through a violent revolution. And so France had also helped us in our war for independence. So when we think about like American support for the French Revolution, this is something where the people supported, France. Like when you think about Citizen Genet. Citizen Genet came over to the United States and he was riling people up. People loved him. They wanted to hear him speak. There were some South Carolinians here in my home state that they commissioned privateers. Okay. They commissioned these, these private ships that would go raid British commerce. And so, of course, Washington responded with the Neutrality Proclamation, which Jefferson, was disappointed there. Jefferson, he didn't want to send troops to France or anything like that, but Jefferson thought that it would be best just to kind of be silent about it, that we shouldn't, by declaring ourselves officially neutral, that we were hanging France out to dry in Jefferson's, in Jefferson's mind. And so in those terms, that the Quasi-War, now a couple things that are happening at the end of the Washington administration. There's the Jay Treaty, which the Jay Treaty, this was something where Britain gets like special trade favors, most favored nation trading status in return for doing some things that they'd already agreed to do, such as, getting out of American forts during, after the Revolutionary War. In the Treaty of Paris, 1783, the British had already promised to abandon American forts. And so, they promise again to do that, what they already promised. And so people, are burning John Jay in effigy. He said on one occasion, he said that I could walk from one end of the country to the other by the light of my burning effigies. Then at the tail end of the Washington administration, Washington recalls James Monroe as the ambassador to France. And he does it because James Monroe is too pro-French. Okay, so basically, come back here, James Monroe. You love that country too much that we sent you to. So you see here that there is that foreign policy conflict. So if the Quasi-War can be used as an illustrative example, then that's great. If you can use the Quasi-War as an example to illustrate the foreign policy conflicts within the first two-party system, then that's something that I think would be, that would be, good to do there. And so going from that, that's going to be something that would be, that would be important in terms of that. But again, there are a lot of different things that you could use, that you could use for this. But again, it sets some contextualization for the Alien and Sedition Acts. So going from there, we also see here hard time associating certain events with the president. What are our tips here? The thing is, yeah, I mean, just look, one thing, Madeline, for your assignment, I would say start with the events. Instead of starting with the president and trying to find like 4 events for this president, I would start with events. I'd match the events to the president. That would be my suggestion there. And so with that, Parliament and the Constitution. Now that's something there, Titus. That is a strange question, okay? But the difference between Parliament and the Constitution, Parliament was a British, was a British governing body, and the Constitution doesn't suck. Okay, that's about all I can say there. The question's a little bit vague, and so what are the important acts to know? Okay, so Logan, as far as put in place by the British on the colonists, okay, I would say that the most important is the Stamp Act. Okay, so when you think about like the 1760s and Parliament taxing the colonies, the most important thing that you're going to want to note there is the Stamp Act. Okay, so Logan, all right, looks like we have like Wolverine in the house or something like that. So let me go ahead and pull this up here. Let's see what we've got here. All right. So as far as that, I want to note here that when we think about the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and the Townshend Acts, okay, that's what we see here during the during the 1760s. So when we think about like this first phase, so on one hand you've got Parliament taxing the colonies. I don't think that I meant to do anything there. All right, Parliament taxing the colonies. Now the Stamp Act causes the much trouble. It causes the most trouble because it's a direct tax. Now the way that I tend to explain this is the Sugar Act, which actually lowered the tax on sugar, on imported sugar, but it didn't, it lowered the tax on imported sugar, but they actually collected it. So let's say the tax was $10, but it wasn't collected. Now it's going to be $5 and it's going to be collected. Just give me 1 second, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to grab me some hydration over here. All right, so as far as that goes, the Sugar Act, it technically cuts the tax, but it's actually going to be collected. So effectively, it's a tax increase. Now, this is something that upsets the colonists, but what we want to note here, while it may upset the colonists, if your parents ask you to give them your cell phone, you wouldn't like that, but you don't dispute their authority to take your phone away from you. Okay, so if they take your phone away from you, you're like, okay, I don't like this, but I don't dispute their ability to do it. Now, let's say that your parents are upset with you. They're like, you know what? I don't like the way that you've been acting here. Your grades haven't been so great. And, you're going to sleep outside for a week and we're not going to feed you. Now that's going to go beyond their authority. Okay. Your parents do not have the right to children don't have a lot of rights, but you have basically the right to food, clothing, and shelter and not to be abused. Those are your rights. So if your parents say that you're going to be, like out sleeping outside for a week, they don't have a right to do that. And the Stamp Act, so nobody disputes Parliament's right to tax imports. So the Sugar Act, it upsets some people, and there may be a little tarring and feathering and stuff like that. But the Stamp Act is especially offensive because it hasn't gone before the colonial legislatures. And that's where Parliament says, well, we virtually represent the colonies, which after like 2020 virtual schooling, you can kind of laugh at that in a whole new way. When Parliament says, well, you're virtually represented here. Now, note here that the colonists, they didn't want to be represented in Parliament. What they wanted was the tax to go before their own representatives in places like the Virginia House of Burgesses. And so with that, the Stamp Act is this internal tax on legal documents, newspapers, playing cards, basically legal documents and paper products. And so with that, you see the stamp, and of course, the colonists, they protest the stamp with things like this. Okay, this is the stamp, this is the fatal stamp. Now you can see here's an Eazy-E album from the 1980s. And this is about the time when like they start putting explicit lyric stamps on like rap and heavy metal music. Now, of course, those of you growing up now, y'all don't, it doesn't really matter because y'all can find this music anywhere. But there was this time where it was very difficult for, a high school student. If you weren't 17, like you couldn't buy this rap album or this heavy metal album or something like that if it had bad words in it, or it addressed subjects that weren't seen as fit for people under 17. So the big thing here, no taxation without representation. And again, they didn't want a handful of representatives in Parliament. They wanted to be they wanted it to go before their representatives. So those are some important acts. Now, I think the Boston Massacre is also something that's important, and also noting how Paul Revere, I always like to use this one for some POV analysis because Paul Revere was a member of the Sons of Liberty. Excuse me. So he depicts the British as basically firing upon this innocent crowd out here. Whereas, in real life, like the British were actually, they were being pelted with snowballs, with rocks, with sticks. They were being dared to fire. Note how Paul Revere puts the moon. He puts it there, but he puts it out of view. So you can't really tell here that this is going on at night. So I think the Boston Massacre is always a good thing. And then the Tea Act, note that the Tea Act was not a tax. The Tea Act was a monopoly, basically a de facto monopoly on tea, that they gave a special favor to the British East India Company. And so with that of course, that ticked off the tea smugglers, and that leads to the Boston Tea Party, which of course leads to the Intolerable Acts, which lead to the First Continental Congress. One of the most important things is to timeline this and make sure, even if you don't know every event, that you think about the cause and effect relationships. And the Intolerable Acts, you can go into, you don't have to know. I mean, if you're trying to get a 5 on the exam, sure, maybe you should know all 5. But even if you just know that they closed the Boston port and they put Massachusetts under martial law, okay? But you can go, just depending on what you're trying to get on the exam, depends on how much you need to know. But make sure the biggest thing here is, that you know the cause and effect relationships. So if you can get all of those, if you can name all of those things, it doesn't do you any good. But if you can have 4 things that happened between the French and Indian War and the Declaration of Independence, and you can do cause and effect relationships with them, then that's something that definitely works. All right. So with that, let's see if we've got anything. Yeah. So the intolerable / coercive acts. Let me go ahead and give y'all a little link here. The intolerable acts. Okay, so let me just note here. Okay, so I've got something here. I'm going to share a Google Doc here that is, let's see, restricted. Let's see, I don't need to restrict that. We're going to copy that link, and I'm going to go ahead and share this here. and I'll also share it in the YouTube chat. All right, so let's go ahead and get that going. The War of 1812, we will look at that tomorrow. So questions about the War of 1812. Wow, that was something. Dragon energy. What should we be writing as a response this time? So y'all go ahead and ask, like, what should we be writing as a, like, if we think about a phrase to cross out on the exam, what should we make that? Like, just something to kind of write all as like a little private joke and then cross out. Let's go ahead and think about that, because I've used a lot of things in the past, like dragon energy. We did like supreme leader a few years ago. It was funny. So with that, let me go ahead and go into this, the intolerable acts. So I've got this handout that I just shared in the chats that we see here historical context. So basically, you want to know that the intolerable acts, it is a process going back to the Tea Act, okay? And I explain what that is. And then we see the Sons of Liberty. They dress up like Mohawk Indians. Now, the choice to dress up like Mohawk Indians is, first of all, a disguise. Now, nobody thought that these were actually Mohawk Indians, but it's hiding these people's true identities. And it's also symbolically identifying themselves as Americans rather than being British. Okay, so they're making a cultural statement there. They're saying we're identifying as people who are Americans rather than people who are British subjects. So the Sons of Liberty, they board these ships carrying tea, and they dump like what would today be about $1.7 million. And that's the Boston Tea Party. And so basically, Parliament passed the Coercive Acts or the Intolerable Acts. And again, there are 5 of them here, depending on what your goals are. I think if you're just trying to pass the exam, the Boston Port Act, that it closed the Boston port until the tea is paid for. That would be the most important one. Followed by, I would say, the Massachusetts Government Act, which placed the Massachusetts colony under martial law. Again, depending on your goals, 3, 4, 5, that dictates how deeply you need to learn this stuff. So then the Quartering Act. Now, remember, there already was a Quartering Act. Sometimes I like to think of the Intolerable Acts in the same kind of breath that I would think of the, of the Compromise of 1850. Because if you compare the Quartering Act to the Fugitive Slave Act, that there was already a Fugitive Slave Act, and then there's another one in 1850, it's similar here, that there already was a Quartering Act, but now the Quartering Act is going to be, is going to be a stronger one. So instead of having a situation where there are more, so instead of a situation where the colonists just were obligated to quarter, British troops, now the British governor could say troops are going to be quartered there. Now, let me remind y'all, if y'all are here and y'all are, on YouTube, remember to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. All right, so with that, these are our, let's see. So then the Administration of Justice Act, British people are going to go to, they're going to be sent to Britain for trial, okay, so that they don't have to face an American jury, which is especially insulting because the British soldiers that were involved in the Boston Massacre, they got a fair trial. And then finally, the Quebec Act. It expanded the borders of Quebec, and this is something kind of like for those of you who have siblings, your parents sometimes will punish you by doing something bad to you, but then the other thing that they might do something nice for your siblings. And so the Quebec Act, basically, while the 13 colonies are being punished in various degrees, the British expand the borders of the province of Quebec, and then they allow the French to collect taxes to support a state-supported Catholic Church. Dun, dun, dun. All right, so the thing is, what we want to note here is the Intolerable Acts. The effect of the Intolerable Acts was to create unprecedented unity within the colonies. The First Continental Congress, had basically, it got 12 colonies to send delegates to a Continental Congress. That was more than had shown up at a Stamp Act Congress some years before. So we see here that relations between the British colonies and the British government would not recover. So I would say that the Intolerable Acts, in a lot of ways, kind of represent a point of no return. I think at any point before the Intolerable Acts, you could have seen this, you could have seen this go in that direction. So with that, Grace, I've answered this question. If anybody goes to this later and clicks on that, I've just answered Grace's question. And so with that, going into this, were there sectional tensions regarding slavery at this time, Ruby? I would say no, in this sense, because what happens is after the American Revolution. So if we're looking at the legacies of the American Revolution, one of the things we see here is that northern states by 1800, almost every state north of the Mason-Dixon line, New Jersey followed suit a little bit later, they pass a gradual emancipation law. Now note here, when you look at this data, these states, they weren't incredibly dependent on slavery. Okay, so and then note here that these are gradual emancipation laws. While most of these laws are being passed in the 1780s and even some in the 1790s, you see where where basically like it's the 1840s where we're actually seeing slavery disappear in these states, which also I think makes sense when you see the abolitionist movement gaining steam. But this wasn't really a controversial thing. It's just these states did this, and there you go. Now, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, that was something where slavery, slavery was not going to be added to this territory here. The Northwest Territory, this territory between Mississippi River and the Ohio River, in 1787, there wasn't really a debate between the North and the South about forbidding slavery there. And in fact, part of the reason for that was that slaveholders in Virginia, it reflected their interest, because that way these people here can't compete with them. So this was something that if slavery were allowed here, it could have created an outlet for competition in this very fertile Ohio River Valley. And so it was in Virginia's best interest not to vote, to vote for the 1787 Northwest Ordinance, because it was something, so this is something where people are being more cooperative. Now, also, as I mentioned before, when we look at the slave trade, the end of the slave trade in 1808, actually, I thought that I had my screen on and I did not, okay? So with that, you see these are the states that passed gradual emancipation laws before 1800, and then there is New Jersey that followed suit shortly after. So the Northwest Ordinance, that's this territory here, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan, these areas where it was basically, there wasn't a big debate over the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. This was something that the northern states did. The southern states that depended on slavery did not. Now, what we also want to note here is we don't want to confuse these gradual emancipation laws with the granting of equal rights or voting rights or anything like that. Some of these northern states even banned free black settlement in the states. And so not only didn't grant voting rights, but said if you're not white, you can't come in here and live here. So another thing about the American Revolution is we want to note religious freedom, the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom in 1786, which disestablished the Anglican Church. Okay, so before the American Revolution, Virginians paid taxes to support the Anglican Church, and the freedom to practice other faiths was limited. Okay, it wasn't non-existent, but the Anglican Church definitely got preference. So after, there could be no mandatory taxes to support any church, and there was complete freedom of religion. And so with that, Jefferson actually put the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom on his epitaph. When you go and look at Jefferson's tombstone, it was to him one of his three greatest accomplishments. And one of those three greatest accomplishments was not having been president of the United States for Jefferson. So with that, now also note federalism. Okay, so as far as that goes, when we think about the Articles of Confederation in the early years under the Constitution, then on one hand, the states had cooperated to win their independence from Britain in the Revolutionary War, but to a point. Okay, so we see with the Articles of Confederation, certainly there is still room for the states. And when we look at our national motto here, E pluribus unum, out of many, one. Okay, and now, of course, Abigail Adams wrote to her husband, remember the ladies in this new code of laws that you'll make, but we don't see any political rights or voting rights for for women, or even the right for married women to own property. Okay, so married women, most of their property went into their husband's hands. Now, one thing to note here, a wife did retain some control over real estate, because that was seen as that is her inheritance, that's going to go to the children. So typically a husband, when you hear, for example, George Washington freed his slaves when he died, he freed his slaves, not Martha's slaves. Okay, most of those slaves were slaves that Martha brought into the marriage. And so as far as that goes, George Washington did not have like control over like real property. But when it came to personal property, Martha Washington, had no control over personal property and money. And so as far as that goes, now speaking of women during this time as well, Republican motherhood, and we're speaking of Republican motherhood, small r Republicanism, not you've got Justice Barrett and all of her kids there, not that kind of Republican motherhood, but basically like motherhood in a republic, that a mother is supposed to play a key role in raising her sons and daughters to become good Republican citizens. So, the mother is the child's first teacher. And because of that, both boys and girls need to be, educated to an extent, taught how to read. And that's something that goes back to ancient Sparta, like, that you have this strong Republican mother that tells her son to come back with the shield or on it. Basically, come back from battle victorious or come back dead. So as far as that goes, ladies and gentlemen, now remember, Romulus APUSH review is available at the App Store and Google Play. I think it's a helpful little trivia app as you're getting in some last minute studying. So consider that. Also, we've got the APUSH multiple choice. If you go to crowdcast.io/Tom Richey, or if you're on YouTube, it's posted here in the chat and in the video description. So that's going to happen tomorrow on Tuesday at 9:30 p.m. Now, if you purchase the multiple choice strategy session, you'll get a link that will enable your friends to watch it as well. Okay, so I'll put a link out there. Your friends can watch it. If you're a teacher, your students can watch it. So as far as that Among Us time, let me see here if I can pull that up there. I might have one game in me. Let's see. Let me see if my because there was some trouble earlier. So let's see. It's coming up now. Let me see here. So sign in. I think, let's see, continue. All right, Face ID. Okay, it's been a little while and they've made some updates. So let's see what they've got here. Let's see. So we're going to redeem purchased items. Let's see, proceed. Okay, did I purchase stuff here? Okay, so let's see here. Let's see what we can do here. So online. And we will host, let's do a private game. Okay, so let's see. I'm going to host a game. I'm going to create a game. All right, let's do like a 10-player game here. All right, so I'm going to start this game. And the code is DFDEAF. DFDEAF. Okay, that is the code. And so I'm going to, between this and the Euro broadcast, we'll go ahead and do that. Okay, so let's see, DFDEAF, and we'll play a little game there. Now, I will be back tomorrow to go into 1800 to 1848 or even 1860. Okay, so the early 19th century. Yeah, the review session is over tonight, but we are going to be back tomorrow, 6:30 p.m. Eastern. It is always a pleasure.